For this edition of Montami Mongolian National News Agency's Mongolia Today magazine, we are pleased to feature an interview with honored cultural figure of Mongolia, writer and poet Ayurzana Gun-Aajav. Ayurzana Gun-Aajav is a writer who has been recognized as a prominent voice in the world of Mongolian literature and culture over the past 35 years, following the Mongolian Democratic Revolution of 1990. He was one of the founders of the first privately owned independent newspapers in the country and has worked in the fields of poetry, fiction, translation, literary criticism, and cultural education. His poetry collections, including philosophical poems and Non Plus Ultra, as well as his fictional works like Blues of a Loveless World and The Legend of the Shaman, and analytical studies of the secret history of the Mongols, such as the Script of Ether, have garnered wide readership and have been translated and published in multiple foreign languages. Author Ayurzana is also one of the few Mongolian authors selected for a residency in the prestigious International Writing Program at the University of Iowa. In this interview, we delve into the secret history of the Mongols, a key source of Mongol literature and its role in shaping the intellectual heritage and future vision of the Mongols. Years ago, you stated in an interview, "I have decided to devote the rest of my life to ensuring that the secret history of the Mongols claims its rightful place in the intellectual world of humankind and receives the recognition it deserves. For a writer to view their own life in such a way and to express it so openly is indeed quite exceptional. If I may ask, why specifically the secret history of the Mongols and why dedicate the rest of your life to it?"
As a Mongol writer, the literary work to which I feel most indebted is The Secret History of the Mongols. I read The Secret History relatively late. I attempted to read it when I was in the 5th or 6th grade, but wasn't able to grasp it that well. Most children of my generation became avid readers around that age, but for some reason, The Secret History did not resonate with Nivang. It was also only later, around the year 1990, that I began to approach the work with greater intellectual seriousness. At that time, Dadam Shenjmitov was en route to meet Lev Nikolaevich Gomidov in Leningrad and stopped by the Maxim Gorky Literature Institute, where I was studying. The institute was a regular stop for Mongolian writers traveling abroad, and Dadam Shenjmitov had just printed a transcribed version of The Secret History in traditional Mongol script. Poet Batumurmanov Suen and I spent an entire evening in conversation with Dadam Shenjmitov. On the first page of the book, he inscribed my name, signed it, and presented it to me. That book is still in my possession to this day. At that time, our national consciousness was at a revival stage, and even for those of us in the Russian Federation, it had a profoundly uplifting effect. Thereafter, I attempted to read The Secret History alongside its original script. Reading The Secret History in parallel with the traditional Mongol script creates a unique intellectual environment. In my view, compared to reading the Cyrillic version by Dandan Surensend, this experience evoked a feeling that there was something deeper, something beyond the visible text. The numerous commentaries and analytical annotations by Dadam Shenjmitov were also highly engaging. It was during this period that I first conceived the idea that, aside from the main text familiar to us, a secondary underlying text might also exist. I initially wrote my novel, Ilbzeregle, when I was in my early 30s. At that time, I had already conceptualized the idea concerning the hidden text of The Secret History. In the novel, the main character consistently completes his manuscript only to burn it and then proceeds to write it anew. The subtext underlying that narrative was, in essence, The Secret History. Accordingly, I began to write parallel notes on The Secret History. After the year 2000, these notes began to accumulate considerably. It is often the case that If a person does not express an idea at the moment of its conception, it may eventually find its way to another individual. Indeed, I began encountering ideas similar to mine in newly published writings about the secret history. Later, I came across texts that overlapped directly with my thoughts. As a result, I decided to stop writing solely for myself and instead eventually published my notes on the secret history. Thus, my book, Tingrin's Cigar, or The Script of Ether, came to be. I regard the Script of Ether as a lifelong literary undertaking. This year, I plan to publish its third edition. The statement, I have decided to devote the rest of my life to ensuring that the secret history of the Mongols claims its rightful place in the intellectual world of humankind and receives the recognition it deserves, was not made in my capacity as a researcher, but rather as a writer. My intention in making that statement was simply to express the belief that if any Mongolian writer is to feel indebted to any literary work, that work is undoubtedly the secret history of the Mongols.
The Secret History of the Mongols was recently published by Penguin Random House as part of its Penguin Classics series, and a translation by scholar Christopher Pratt Atwood. This development can be considered a transition of the work from scholarly circles to ordinary readership worldwide, when compared with Eastern and Western classical literary heritage from the same historical period. How valuable is the Secret History of the Mongols as a literary text?
There is no literary work in Mongolia that has been more thoroughly studied than the secret history of the Mongols. It has been the subject of rigorous scholarship from the perspectives of history, linguistics, and literature. Its release under the Penguin Classics indicates that, from the standpoint of literary studies, it has reached a considerably elevated level. However, we tend to misunderstand the secret history to a great extent. Any written work is open to multiple interpretations, yet we have continued to perceive it from a single, fixed angle. This diminishes the value of a work that is inherently rich in meaning. The more resonant a text is, the more valuable it becomes. In our context, the text of the secret history has not been allowed to resonate. For instance, let us take just the opening lines of the secret history. The origin of Genghis Khan. Bort Chan, born destined from the Dagstinger, or heavens above. His wife was Gwamero. Bort Chan, with his wife Gwamero, came across the sea and settled at the headwaters of the Ononmurun River at Mount Bulhanhaldorn, where their son Batchagan was born. To this day, no processed version of these three sentences, for example, has been formulated in a way that allows accurate understanding by modern readers. In the Middle Mongol language, there were no punctuation marks such as commas, colons, or dashes. The text was written to be understood through the intonation of the person reading it. Gadam Shanchmitov proposed an idea that the phrase the origin of Genghis Khan may have been written with an intentional line break for emphasis. This is similar to how the name of Genghis Khan is separated and emphasized on the memorial stele of Yesunge. However, the word origin, or ozor, appears 3 times in the secret history. First, in the passage with the line break mentioned above. Second, it is used in the geographical sense, referring to the source that flows into the Halh River and Lake Boyer. Third, when Shihihutargal is found among the Tatars, he is described as the descendant of a noble origin. Thus, the meaning of the word is crystal clear. It signifies lineage, ancestry, or descent. In the Boyat and Bargu dialects, the word ozur is still actively used today with this very meaning. Nonetheless, some people firmly interpret this line-separated phrase as a proper name. However, the phrase Genghis Khan's origin, Bortachan, born destined from the dead Tingder, remains unclear in its intended meaning to this day. We are too accustomed to almost unconsciously saying Genghis Khan, born destined from the heavens above, but the phrase born with his destiny ordained by Godbid Pinder is part of the phrase Chengli Gutu, found among approximately 50 Hamid words recorded in Chinese characters. Chengli undoubtedly means heaven. Even a modern Chinese native speaker would likely pronounce heaven as Chenli. The word Gutu means blessing, grace, or destiny. Therefore, the phrase Chengli Gutu means heaven's blessing or divine destiny. During the Manchu era, this concept was Sinicized and translated as Son of Heaven. Consequently, even today, many Mongolians continue to use the term Son of Heaven. This translation persists even now, but in reality, Son of Heaven does not exist in the original script. Being destined by heaven and being a child of heaven are two entirely different concepts. The idea of a son of heaven is closer to the Christian theological notion of a divine son. When we read the most commonly circulated version of the text, it is typically read as the origin of Genghis Khan, Bortachon, who was born with his destiny ordained by the dead Tingir. His wife was Gwamaral. From this structure, it reads as if Genghis Khan's wife was Gwamaral. Just as a Mongolian might speak incorrectly but understand correctly, we instinctively know that Gwamaral was not the wife of Genghis Khan. Yet, someone unfamiliar with the text would read the primary text and misinterpret it in this way. Therefore, we must revise the structure of the secret history without changing its original wording. We can clarify meaning by introducing punctuation marks, such as periods, spaces, or commas. For example, a colon may be inserted after the words origin of Genghis Khan, preserving the original wording. So claim that the secret history cannot be understood in its original form and is only comprehensible through the translation by Dabin Suren Tend. This view is incorrect, as the text in question is not something that should be translated in the first place. For example, researchers have grouped and studied the use of the word boring in the first section of the text. It appears twice. First, about Bortichon, who was born with his destiny ordained by the heavens above. And second, about Batchagan, born while residing at the headwaters of the Onam River at Mount Burhan-Halgun. These two instances of the word born are understood differently. No one interprets born with his destiny ordained by the upper heaven as a literal birth from the womb of heaven. That said, in the cases born while residing at Mount Burhan-Halgun, it is often interpreted narrowly to mean that Batchagan was born from Gwamaral. This interpretation distorts the original text. In the Mongolian language, the word born does not refer exclusively to childbirth or the biological birth of offspring from a female. The phrase Batchagan, born while residing, implies that Batchagan and his lineage had lived in that land for generations and that he was a rightful inhabitant of that territory. When we say someone is born beautiful, we're not referring to someone physically attractive at birth. Rather, we mean that they are a person of good character or state at present. Nevertheless, this modern interpretation is not applied to Batchagan. Instead, people insist on interpreting it in the literal, narrow sense and thereby claim that Batchagan must be the son of Bortichon and Gwamaral. In truth, a distinct totemic concept is being conveyed here. Many issues like this must be clarified because we have not done so we still fail to appreciate the true value of the secret history. And this is just the tip of the iceberg on this matter.
You have presented an insightful interpretation regarding the chronology of the writing of the secret history of the Mongols. Is it accurate to say that the secret history was written in the year 1240?
In general, the period in which the main part of the secret history of Mongols was written is relatively clear. The text begins with the phrase, the origin of Chinggis Khan, and continues until the line, in the year of the pig, Chinggis Khan ascended to Tingir, or heaven, at which point the main theme concludes. It is possible that following the death of Chinggis Khan, many of the remarkable legends and narratives that are found, including those in Altan Topchi, may have been lost. Historical details such as the accounts of his socks being sanctified in Orgos and transported by cart may or may not have been included in the original, but certain parts of the primary manuscript were likely either omitted or deliberately removed. Nonetheless, the principal narrative ends with the death of Chinggis Khan. This can be confirmed through one particular detail. In the sections concerning the enthronement of Ogordi Khan after Chinggis Khan, the main Tagade is never written simply as Tagade. In the Uyghur Mongolian script, it is written as Tagade Aga, which in today's terms corresponds to brother Tagade. In this context, it is impossible to refer to Tagade without using the term brother, expressing respect. In contrast, when referring to Chinggis Khan, the name Temujin is used without a title, whereas Tagade is addressed with honorifics as brother Tagade. This suggests that texts from two different periods were combined into one. As for the end of the secret history, when exactly is the full moon month of the year of the rat? Essentially, it corresponds to the autumn of the year of the rat, following the death of Chinggis Khan, which would be 1228. In general, scholars now appear to have reached a consensus around the year 1228. However, in the recently released Penguin Classics edition, scholar Christopher Pratt Atwood dates it even later. That is his view and his concern, but even Mongolian scholars, some tend to date the composition of the secret history even later. This interpretation is linked to the notion that during the proposal to enthrone Ogurde, the idea was raised that if no capable individual should emerge from Ogurde's line, then a worthy person from Chinggis Khan's lineage would ascend to the throne. Some interpret this as a later addition meant to justify the enthronement of Mo Khan, thus pushing the date of composition forward. However, this line does not indicate that the original text was revised or tampered with to justify someone's claim to the throne. Rather, it reflects the traditional Mongolian code of ethics. This was the customary practice. The nobles would convene and elect a Han through an assembly. While this may be viewed as an aristocratic democracy, it is a democracy nonetheless. If a particular individual proves unworthy, then whoever is capable shall ascend the throne under that democratic principle. Thus, there is no evidence that the text of the secret history was revised or tampered with for this reason. The secret history itself embodies a profound ethical code of the Mongols. At the time of Obode Khan's enthronement, Shuaikwi stated that should no capable individual arise from his lineage, he would not oppose the offension of another not worthy descendant from the lineage of Chinggis Khan.
This reflects a democratic way of thinking, does it not?
From this point of view, the year 1228 is indeed of great importance. Even if the connection to Ogode is appropriate and the text had been completed by 1240, Ogode would have added his own section to an already completed text. This is evident from the example of Brother Tagate. Perhaps all Hans since Ogode should have added their sections. Yet, the record appears to have been interrupted. Whether it ceased with Guyuk Khan or was disrupted later when the capital was relocated is unclear. In any case, the main body of the text is undoubtedly the history of Chinggis Khan. By the year 1228, this history had already been compiled and completed. Why is the mention of the Ehurulbe, or the Assembly of the Mongol Nobles, is so important? It is possible that the Ehurulbe itself formally ratified the text in the year of the rat during the month of assembly. After all, the secret history of the Mongols was a secret history specifically related to the golden lineage. There is documentary evidence showing that the text was not provided to other high-ranking scripture officials during the Yuan dynasty. At present, since the text is accessible to us, we tend to question what aspect of it could be considered secret. But in truth, it was originally intended solely for those of the Olgan lineage. That is precisely why the original Mongolian version has not been found to this day. Before the political repressions of the 1930s, the Altan Topchi was discovered by Jamyangun of Onhut. Many other such versions had likely existed. The law forbidding the text from being shown to outsiders remained in force even during the time of the Mongol Ilkhanate. Rashid Albin, in his Compendium of Chronicles, mentioned, "I myself have not seen it, but our Han has such a book." The Altan Defter, or the Golden Notebook, known to have been held by Ghazan Han and Uzit Han, was most likely the secret history.
Yeah. Most of
If we focus on the idea that the secret history of the Mongols was written in 1228, let us reflect on the literary heritage of that time. In Japan, the tale of Denji and the Song of Roland also belong to that era. In Russia, there was the tale of Igor's campaign. Comparing these works of literature, it appears that a major literary works by humankind from various countries came to life around the same time. In comparison, how powerful is the secret history of the Mongols as a literary work? How phenomenal is it? At the beginning of the 13th century, when the secret history of the Mongols was being written, the most prominent and widely known texts in the world were the Holy Bible and the Quran. Alongside the Quran, 1001 Nights may have also existed. Other scriptures had not yet spread. The history of the Mongols' acquisition of writing traces back to the civilizations of the Mediterranean. It can be traced as far back as the Thinmishins and the Sumerians. Looking at the history of Mongolian script alone, it was derived from Sobdian. The Sobdian and Uyghur scripts are quite similar. Even now, there exists a stone inscription in Sobdian script in a place called Talas in Kyrgyzstan. We can almost decipher it with ease. Later, in the early 20th century, a large corpus of Uyghur script texts was transported from Turfan to Germany. With the use of modern computer technology, some of the manuscripts currently identified as Uyghur may likely contain Mongolian script texts, such as the tale of Soharnai. Thus, the heritage of Mongolian, Uyghur, and Sobdian scripts consistently moves westward. To say it moves westward means that the path of writing systems from Phoenician to Aramaic and from Aramaic to Sobdian may have encountered closest with the Bible. The term Bible was used in Greek. but the original texts are nearly identical to the Hebrew Torah. Therefore, when speaking of the history of adopting a writing system, it is not merely about adopting characters, but about whether the meanings and texts those scripts convey are also adopted. This brings forth an entirely different matter. Accordingly, there is substantial information about Western civilization present in the intellectual and spiritual formation of the Mongols. This is not merely a phenomenon of the imperial period. When Genghis Khan spoke to Changchun, he said, "Since the time of our Shan Yu." Thus, he considered himself as a successor of the Hun Empire. In this context, Shan Yu is most likely Mulgun. If we examine the history and biography of Mulgun, we find that he was raised as a hostage among the Yuezhi. The Yuezhi were Kochalian people who spoke an ancient Persian language. Therefore, it is likely that Mulgun spoke Persian in addition to Mongolian. One cannot live as a hostage without learning the language of the place. Later, even the Kazakh ruler Ablay Khan, who was raised as a hostage among the Oirats, was said to speak fluent Mongolian. In light of this, when the Mongols adopted a script, they also absorbed a tremendous amount of civilization and the worldview of major texts. That worldview is directly reflected in the secret history. The passage referencing the origin of Genghis Khan resembles biblical narratives. For this reason, it can be asserted that in the early 13th century, the Mongols produced a work of global stature. Such a possibility existed only in Mongolia as the ruler of the world. Perhaps the Hun Empire had a similar opportunity, but no text has survived from their time. The Hun Empire governed the Silk Road, as did the Shanbei. Only after the Hun and Shanbei empires did the Chinese people first come to know the Silk Road by passing through the Gansu corridor. From this perspective, the world of the nomads is a world that radiates in many directions. Emperor Qin Shi Huang built the Great Wall of China to prevent movement southward, but the nomads advanced westward along the Silk Road. Therefore, all the known textual achievements of humankind at that time are reflected in the secret history. This is not something that can be dissected from an emotional point of view. Every text contains the code beneath its surface. When Mongols speak about themselves, it may sound to foreigners as if they are boasting or trying to conceal their weaknesses while exaggerating their strengths. But in truth, a Mongol person has no need to exaggerate himself. There's a saying, people with such a history have no need to justify himself. In reality, from among the vast expanse stretching from the Arabs to the Pacific Ocean, there is no nation other than Mongolia that has left behind such a structured and refined textual legacy in terms of written culture. Yet, the space occupied by Mongols in the nomadic world is relatively small in terms of land and population. The territory of the Turkic-speaking peoples is vast. Meanwhile, when the Turks were still nomads, aside from the few tales and epics, they did not leave behind written literature. And when classics itself serves as evidence, this series prints the highest achievements of humanity. Scholars today, recognizing that this literary work truly deserves its place, commissioned its translation to Christopher Pratt Atwood, who is regarded as the most capable and respected among today's Mongolists. The translation contains very few additions to the three main and one revised translation that were previously published. However, as Atwood is himself a Mongolist and an outstanding scholar, he needed to include his own research alongside the text. This has become a marvelous work that demonstrates the value of the secret history as a literary work.
You have published a 3-volume work on the secret history of the Mongols, the Mongolian language, and culture. In the first volume, you conducted an ethical analysis of the secret history. Rather than focusing on the textual details, you explored its moral traces and ethical codes. You identified 14 moral and ethical codes that reflect the mindset of the Mongols of that time. Please tell us more about these 3 volumes.
In the Western world, a system for educating and cultivating human beings was established long ago. They possess scriptures that justify and serve as the foundation of that system. The underlying view of what constitutes a moral, well-educated, and well-mannered person in today's Western civilization, and perhaps even in global civilization, originates in the Bible. From the Bible, they derive ethical codes concerning what is good and evil and how a person ought to be. As the Bible was written in ancient times, in an era without organized religion, it contains many rituals reminiscent of what we understand as shamanistic practices, such as sky worship. Yet, those who saw ethics within it meticulously dissected its contents, and through this process, the ethical system of religion formed from the Bible. Western civilization developed upon this foundation. Now, do we have something comparable? Most people have assumed that we do not. There is even a widely circulated anecdote that Ren Damp once said, "Since Mongols have no concept of virtue, there is no need to translate that word." But in truth, how could that possibly be? A Mongolian person has always possessed profound ethics, discipline, a sense of order, and adherence to rules and laws, as well as a capacity for unity. Only with such qualities could they have established such a vast empire. In world history, there has never been an empire as expansive as the Mongol Empire, which united neighboring peoples of diverse cultures across the vast continent. In order to govern people of entirely different cultural backgrounds, it is self-evident that one would need a different set of laws and rules. We have only one surviving text that attests to this. By examining how the noble qualities of the Mongolian individual were reflected in the secret history of the Mongols, written during the imperial era, 14 distinct values can be identified. For instance, Mongols are often described as not being punctual or as lazy. In contrast, during that time, Mongols were shrilly punctual and by no means lazy. The era in which Mongols became unpunctual and indolent was when they no longer governed their own state, when their state ceased to be their own. Years ago, in another interview, I mentioned this as well. In Buryatia, I worked on developing a set of rules to establish a local branch of a fan club modeled after Mongol fan clubs. When I presented the project and urged them to proceed, the Buryats responded, "Why bother? Why should we do anything? This is not our country." Although they live on their own land, because all governance is in the hands of the Russian Federation, they develop the mindset that they do not live in their own country, and as a result, they lose all initiative. They say it is not a country, so what can we possibly do? Similarly, when the Mongols fell under Manchu rule and their state was no longer their own, they ceased to observe punctuality and lost all ambition. Their weapons were confiscated through taxation, possession of iron was criminalized, and on top of that, a foreign religion was introduced alongside these changes. Thus, the people began to walk the path of spiritual decline. Due to this, it is impossible for us to find, during this period of decline, the ethical code that once empowered the Mongols. Fortunately, we do have a source we can turn to. A complete and unaltered text exists. We have the secret history of the Mongols.
Discussions around the concept of national identity have become increasingly prevalent in Mongolia. At one point, a political party even formed around this idea. It appears that you, too, have contributed thoughts to this concept. How would you articulate the national identity of the Mongolian person?
ер нь
In essence, there are only a few fundamental factors that make a nation a nation. Among these, language and culture are of utmost importance. Even those who sought to subjugate others were acutely aware of this truth. In fact, oppressors deliberately worked against these very elements. For instance, why did Stalin aggressively push to replace the traditional Mongol script? It was precisely to dismantle every intellectual and spiritual foundation that would serve as the basis for Mongolia to remain a distinct nation, to erode all characteristics that could sustain its identity. It would have been unfeasible to teach the Russian language to herders. Yet, there was a concerted effort to make those same herders literate in the Cyrillic script. This in itself constitutes a severe form of cultural suppression. Consider the Cultural Revolution that unfolded between 1966 and 1976, during which nearly 1/6 of the population of Inner Mongolia was affected. Even Chinese historians have later acknowledged this chapter as a period of severe historical error and distortion. That revolution was driven by the premise that there should be no distinct nationalities and no separate languages. There was to be only one nation, which, though not explicitly named, was Han Chinese. It was claimed that there should be a single socialist nation speaking a single language. Under this ideology, Chinese students were sent to reside with herder families across Inner Mongolia. Within the People's Republic of China, the central points of the Cultural Revolution were limited to 2 or 3 cities, such as Beijing, Shanghai, and Chongqing. However, the regions that experienced the full scope of its policy implementation were Inner Mongolia, Tibet, and Xinjiang. This was, in effect, a vast policy against the existence of national identity itself and aimed at eradicating language and culture. These 2 examples alone suffice to demonstrate the immense importance of language and culture. Thus, the primary conditions necessary for a nation to endure are first, its language, and second, its culture. Beyond these lie interests, history, and a myriad of additional factors. Only by preserving and reviewing these elements today can we attain a comprehensive understanding of what is meant by the concept of Mongol identity. Should the language, culture, historical memory, sense of unity, and national interests of the people fall into a state of vulnerability, the very question of whether a nation shall continue to exist becomes uncertain. Let us return to the discussion of the secret history of the Mongols. The legend of Mother Alungol is truly a classical myth, one that appears in numerous variations across the world. For example, Salman Rushdie drew heavily upon this motif in his novel The Enchantress of Florence. While reading the novel, one might think that he is narrating an entirely different story, yet by the conclusion, it becomes apparent that the work is in fact an interweaving of this ancient legend. This realization evoked a sense of enlightenment and awe in me. It led me to understand that I had previously grasped the concept of intertextuality in a rather simplistic manner. Upon witnessing Rushdie's ability to echo and reinterpret that myth with such mastery, I felt a sense of envy. This is because we, as Mongols, are far closer to that legend in essence. Have you ever thought of writing a literary work that resonates with the secret history of the Mongols in the way Rushdie's work does? There have been attempts, of course. Is it something you hold within your heart or perhaps already pursue? In truth, all of the world's literature has, in some manner, originated from prior texts. There have even been scholarly efforts to analyze precisely how many core narrative genes exist in literature. I do not recall exactly what I read in my youth, but if I'm not mistaken, all world literature consists of 6 schemes. These themes are divided according to the progression of their plots. For example, one begins from hardship, rises, and then falls. This closely aligns with the structure of the secret history. Consider how Genghis Khan rose from obscurity to greatness. There is no fall depicted for Genghis Khan. This alone constitutes one theme. Another narrative involves falling and rising again. Numerous stories, such as Cinderella, fall into this category. First, it can be said that all literary works written in the world may be broadly categorized into 6 types. If one were to seek out the sources for these 6 types, they can all be found. Every literary work can ultimately be traced to some earlier form. For instance, The Alchemist, the best-selling novel by Paulo Coelho, is essentially an adaptation of a single tale from 1001 Nights. If one searches diligently, the origin can always be found. Therefore, the creation of something entirely unprecedented is not possible. Humanity has already achieved that. Literature fundamentally is the art of compositional play. The essence lies in how masterfully one plays with structure and how existing texts are deconstructed and reimagined through a new configuration. Each individual already carries the text within themselves. There exists no literary work that expresses something entirely foreign to human consciousness. This is exemplified by 100 Years of Solitude, the most renowned novel of the 20th century, which reinterprets the Bible at its core. This prompts the question of whether that text could in some way be considered our own. You just mentioned Alongo. The secret history itself is an attempt of that very nature. It deconstructs and reconstructs a pre-existing narrative. Alongo was indeed the 9th generation matriarch of Genghis Khan. This is a historical fact. However, whether she gathered her 5 sons following the death of Dobon Merdun and handed them a bundle of 5 arrow shafts is a question of narrative. This is not history. The reason is that the same story can be found in the chronicles from the time of the Xianbei. One prominent Xianbei leader who had 16 sons realized that his kingdom might collapse upon his death. He gathered his sons, gave each a rod to break, and then handed them a bundle of rods to demonstrate unity. The most astonishing aspect of this lies in the question of how the author of the secret history came to know a Xianbei legend dating from the 2nd century, around the year 900. This exemplifies the deeply interlinked culture and heritage of the Mongols. It indicates that the Mongols possessed knowledge of the period prior to the Rouran Khanate. This is evident from the letter Genghis Khan addressed to the esteemed master of Taoism, Chamchun, whom he referred to as our Shan Yu. Moreover, the authorial intent of the secret history, in which the testament of an ancient Xianbei king is rendered as the words of Alungo to her sons, also testifies to this knowledge. Therefore, the secret history of the Mongols is a text that is composed of numerous links and connections. The method used in contemporary literature of taking source texts and adapting them through one's own interpretation was already employed by the Mongolian writer of the secret history in the early 13th century. This in itself is an example that defines its value.
Та сүүлийн 20 гаруй жил
Over the past 2 decades, you have written more than 10 novels. Notably, you have explored and written about subjects that now seem foreign to contemporary Mongolians. For instance, Black, White, Red deals with the tradition of epic chanting. The legend of the shaman engages with the worldview of shamanism. You have also written novels that address traditional medicine, as well as the dual devotion found within Buddhism. Do you plan to publish another literary work on a contemporary theme, such as Blues of a Loveless World?
Танаас ийм бүтээл мод гарах болов уу?
одоогоор миний
My most recently published novel, The Shadow Longer Than Our Soul, portrays a character of the present time. The preceding novel, Spirit Formula, also addresses our current era. When I attempted to link Spirit Formula to the earlier work, I raised questions about what the soul actually is and what its formula might be, which led me to include Injinash, thereby stepping once again into the realm of traditional themes. Though, generally speaking, all of my works converge on a single central question: why is it that contemporary individuals are constantly drawn toward things that do not belong to the present? People have asked me about this. There seems to be a certain peculiar code embedded within the Mongol person. This may be related to the fact that we have not been separated from the nomadic way of life for that long a time. In truth, Westerners are not fundamentally better or more elevated from their primal needs than we are. In fact, we are quite similar. Moreover, before the Crusades, many Westerners did not even know how to bathe. There were no people in the medieval world as generally underdeveloped as the Europeans. During the Middle Ages, the East had already started to flourish. Even a few surviving architectural monuments reflect this. While the Selkut monuments in England bear the character of ancient religious symbols, the Islamic world had already entered a period of a thriving civilization. Thus, the intellectual centers of humanity shift depending on how humankind perceives the world. Although the Mongol person may seem on the surface to have lived in a primitive setting due to a nomadic lifestyle in terms of consciousness, they have progressed quite far. Yet this was wiped away by socialist ideology, which is why it now appears distant to us. If we had not undergone those 70 years of socialism during which we saw our heritage and traditions through a certain filter, we would have remained practically the same. The time in which my grandmother lived was almost identical to the 13th century. From the 13th to the 20th century, over 700 years, the traditional Mongol way of life remained virtually unchanged. For example, the secret history states that sable fur was given upon the birth of Chinggis Khan. Sable fur is a noble's hunting garment, similar in use to a traditional fur swaddling blanket. Since we have become detached from our cultural context, we modernize everything and interpret the sable wrap as proof that Chinggis Khan was born in winter. But what would they have used if Chinggis Khan had been born in summer? My mother was born in 1943. Even at the time of her birth, and up until the cultural campaign of the 1950s, Mongols swaddled children born in summer in sheepskin. This is because in our culture, swaddling a child in sheepskin was the norm. When a birth was imminent, a midwife would be summoned, arriving with a tanned sheepskin. The skin of the sheep used for broth would be tanned and returned to the birth attendant in place of the one brought. This was a custom among nomads. It may even date back to the time of the Hun Empire. What the Mongols had was sheepskin. In the case of nobility, the sable wrapping would be presented as a gift. Midwives had no access to silk or soft cotton, yet people now directly link the material to the season and say that it would be unthinkable to wrap a newborn in fur during summer. Therefore, to properly understand the text, we must not modernize it. People speak of how Temujin and Hasar shot and killed Bektir as if it were a mark of Chinggis Khan's cruelty. In the present day, if someone were to kill a half-brother, legal punishment would certainly follow. Nevertheless, the circumstances at that time were different. The question was whether one would become the head of the Borjigin lineage or be forced to follow under the leadership of a mother. At that time, when a man with multiple wives passed away, his sons would care for the wives who were not their birth mothers. This was the tradition. Bether was 1 year older than Kimujin and had complete control over all 9 of their geldings. He was the head of the lineage. At 13 or 14 years old, he had reached the biological age to take Olun as his wife. If Vector had done so, Temujin would have had no means to oppose his stepfather. What he did was a preemptive action. This was an active, strategic insight, not a murder. In the Ottoman Empire, the newly enthroned sultan would execute all of his brothers. Such brutal practices never existed among the Mongols. Still, when it came to determining who would ascend the throne, there was indeed the struggle. These were ordinary struggles, present in any society. It is politics. Just as someone maneuvers to strengthen their own faction and entrap their opponents, the same logic applies. Therefore, when interpreting historical texts, we must avoid viewing them through the lens of the present day.
Өнөөдрийн хор биш. Харах хэрэгтэй юм шиг байна. Юу н та эх орныхоо ирээдүг?
How do you envision the future of your country? Whenever or whoever it is, there are challenges to avoid and opportunities that must not be missed. Do you reflect much on this?
Байгаа бол ямар зүйл байна?
Монголчууд ер нь
It seems as though the Mongols are a nation destined to live amidst constant challenges. It is almost implausible that the Mongol nation will once again reach a high level of dominance as in the 13th century. Nonetheless, the possibility of guiding this nation toward a bright future remains within our reach. Every individual needs to become fully aware of this. I speak from the perspective of a writer. An economist, a soldier, or a strategist would each express their views from their own standpoint. But a writer resides within the space of the Mongolian language. The Mongolian language is a linguistic space that is shrinking. There was a time when the Mongolian language existed only within the circles of a few provinces, and later it became an international language. Yet today, no one speaks of that history. The reason is that the two countries that inherited the legacy of the era when Mongolian was an international language have now become major global powers and are our immediate neighbors. These nations do not wish to recall that they were once dependent on the smallest and most subordinate neighbor they now border. Among all these historical circumstances, it is imperative that every Mongol understand what must remain ever untarnished and upheld at all times. This is of utmost importance and, arguably, may be more crucial than the sale of coal, our language and culture. The reason I stated that the Mongol language is shrinking at an alarming rate is that it is no longer possible to receive an education in the Mongolian language in Inner Mongolia. A similar phenomenon previously occurred in the former Soviet Union. From 1931 onward, the Mongolian script was eliminated in Buryatia. The Krir script was no longer used in Kalmykia. Moreover, in the 1940s, the Kalmyks were deported. Even today, their population has not yet recovered to the previous members. This is not something unrelated to us. If one were to classify all the countries in the world, the concept of a nation-state would be among the most critical. The state policy of a nation-state lies in preserving, transmitting, and developing the culture and heritage of its nation. China and Russia are indeed nation-states. Russia has federal status and China possesses autonomous regions. However, despite Mongolia's status of a nation-state, it is not concerned with the fate of its own nation. If the pursuit of national policy is being neglected due to economic constraints, then there is no point in being a nation-state. From this perspective, I view the future of Mongolia in terms of the future of a Mongol nation as rather difficult. However, the future of the independent state of Mongolia as a country is not worrisome. Although we achieved independence over only about 40% of our historical territory in the 20th century, this alone is a tremendous accomplishment. Therefore, the future of the Mongol state is secure, and I have no worries in that regard.
Тэрэнд бол би санаа зовдөг. Хоёр янзын яриа байдаг.
There are only two kinds of conversations, those that end and those that do not. This was proven to be the latter. Let us bring this segment to a close here. Writer Ayurzana Gun-Aajav's reflections continue in full through his recently published works. I wish to encourage every Mongolian to read their 3-volume White Collection, released in 2024. May the readership of his 10 Blacks be joined by many who engage with his 3 Whites, both within and beyond our borders. With this wish, we conclude our conversation.
Амжилт хүсье. За баярлалаа.